Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to go live in about 30 seconds. It's still a little bit before 2 o'clock Central. Thank you all for being here. Super excited to have you all, have the Greenlight Nation be part of this webinar Wednesday. So we'll start in about 30 seconds. Meanwhile, in the chat, please, everybody introduce yourself. Let us know your organization and where you are coming from. I would love to see all of the orgs and their locations. Great. Keep those names and locations coming in the chat. Hi everyone. Hi Greenlight community. I'm Jonathan April, the general manager of College Greenlight. I've been with Greenlight since it was an idea back in 2011, so this is my 10th year. Thank you all for being here and being part of our nationwide community, supporting first-gen students on their way to and through college. In the fall, College Greenlight became part of a much bigger organization, EAB, which is a thought leader across so many areas of education: best practice research, enrollment management, student success. We are really excited about how EAB can increase our impact. One of the ways is by bringing a whole new level of expertise to you, our counselor community. EAB has an incredible team focused on financial aid issues. Today, we are here to learn from Kathy, Sarah, and DJ and how best to support your seniors at this crucial time. We have blocked off an hour for today's event, about 35 minutes or so for a presentation, another 15 minutes or so for Q&A. If you do have questions, don't be shy. Please use the Ask a Question box to ask those questions, and we'll try to answer those at the end of the broadcast. Again, thank you for being here. We're really excited to talk about this really important subject of financial aid and bringing you true experts in the space. And now to today's presentation. I'm going to pass it over to my new friend, DJ.
Good afternoon, good morning, maybe for those of you over on the West Coast or further outside of the Central Time Zone. Happy to have all of you with us. My name is DJ Erickson. I'm an associate principal here at EAB. So the topic for today is financial aid, and in a year when supporting students has been more challenging than ever, my colleagues and I really want to position this presentation, our conversation, the data that we have, as well as our backgrounds in admissions, financial aid, and college access as an additional resource for all of you as you support your students in reaching their goals this year. So it really is our hope that today's webinar isn't merely interesting to you all, but really provides some takeaways and resources that you can use immediately, as well as an opportunity on the back half of our time together to ask us in real time about questions related to financial aid or challenges that may be on your minds. So we're honored to have the chance to be with all of you today and grateful for your time. All of us come from a part of EAB called Financial Aid Optimization, which is a part of our work with schools in undergraduate enrollment. And the three of us currently work with a range of colleges and universities in developing their scholarship and financial aid policies and in achieving their undergraduate enrollment goals. Prior to EAB, I myself worked in undergraduate and law admissions for a number of years, but my first role in this field was with College Possible as a high school coach, supporting 40 students at a high school outside of Minneapolis. And so ultimately that college attainment and the work that you do is very familiar to me and really at the foundation of my background. And I'm also honored to be here with two of my amazing colleagues. And just so we're clear, the only reason I'm going first is that this is order of appearance. So I'd like to kick it over to Kathy and then to Sarah to introduce themselves and their backgrounds before we dig into our agenda.
Great, thank you, DJ. Hi, everyone. I am Kathy Ruby, and I'm a principal at EAB. I've been at EAB for almost 2 years now. Prior to that, I was actually a financial aid administrator for most of my career. So I think if I'm counting, almost 3 decades, about 27 years. But then I left the college where I was working, and the one where I worked the longest was St. Olaf College in Minnesota. I left there and I went to work for a company called College Coach, which is actually a company that provides college admission and financial aid, saving for college, repaying loans, all kinds of advice to people all over the country, but they receive it as an employee benefit. So I spent 5 years doing that. I would say that those were 5 of the most enlightening years of my career as I moved to the other side of the desk and learned how families were experiencing the process of paying for college. So excited to be with you here today. I'll pass this off to Sarah now.
Hi, everyone. I am Sarah Leduc, and I also have Minnesota roots. So our company, the financial aid optimization arm of the company, is here in Minnesota. I also spent some time in financial aid and admissions, about 15 years, prior to joining EAB about 5 years ago. So I worked also at St. Olaf College and McAllister College, which is just across the river from me in St. Paul, Minnesota. So now in our EAB world, what we do specifically is work with colleges and universities to discuss financial aid strategy and yield as it pertains to how students are moving. So we are very excited to be here and excited to provide some hopefully really good guidance in terms of the application process this year and how it might be different from other years due to many different factors. So I'll hand it back to DJ and he'll get us started.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Kathy. So our goal today, like Sarah just said, is really to give you a bit of information about a variety of topics, and just to give you a little bit of context in terms of where we're going. You know, you'll see the topics here on the left-hand side of the screen. Ultimately, we wanted to think about this in terms of where your students may be at in their process. Some of them maybe have yet to file the FAFSA. Others have filed the FAFSA, but maybe have yet to receive awards or need to send that FAFSA other places. And some of them may have already submitted the FAFSA and have a variety of awards. And so really we wanted to provide in this sort of progression of the agenda today, a couple of different ways in which you might be in process or your students may be in process, and ways in which you can support them depending on where they are at. But to inspire a little bit more participation right off the bat, and also to inspire Kathy and Sarah and I, and especially me, to move through our presentation in a timely manner, we wanted to pose a question to all of you right at the outset. So please use the chat function to share your responses to the question you see on the screen. What is one of the challenges currently facing your students as you support them in the financial aid process this year? And we'll use the responses in this question to sort of layer into our understanding of where you're at as we discuss our presentation, and then we'll rely on Jonathan to help us revisit a few of these during our Q&A portion perhaps as well. So what is one of the challenges your students are currently facing as you support them in the financial aid process? So as those come in, and Kathy and Sarah will be taking a look, and Jonathan, I'm going to dig in a little bit to some information as we kick it off here in the context of FAFSA filing. So in terms of undergraduate admissions, or what at EAB is called undergraduate enrollment services, which includes financial aid, EAB partners with several hundred colleges and universities all across the country. So even though Kathy and Sarah and I have Minnesota roots, our partner institutions and the schools we work with are all across the US. And as part of the partnership, we support them in analyzing their student enrollment data from the perspective of both admissions and financial aid. And so what I think many of us in this crowdcast room here know today from headlines, anecdotes, and I'm sure all of you undoubtedly know all too well from direct experience with your work, low-income students have seen an outsized negative impact in enrollment during the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's harder than ever for them to reach their goals and the aspirations that they have. So what you see here on this slide is one of the ways that EAB's college and universities partners have seen that impact. And I think this is helpful context for how we talk about the opportunity your students may still have yet this year. So in the gray bars, what you'll see is that college and university partners with EAB admitted more students last year at every EFC band. So we have EFCs ranging from 0 to non-zero Pell eligible EFCs, all the way up to EFCs that are greater than $60,000 on the right. So moving from small EFC or estimated family contribution to large EFC based on FAFSA data. And again, what you'll see is that all but one of those EFC bands saw more students admitted. And despite the increase in volume of these admits that students saw, the colleges and universities admitted at hundreds of more schools. you can see that in the green bars, compared to 2019, enrollment declined in fall 2020 from students in every EFC band, except for those above 40,000 or more. And so ultimately what you're seeing here is that, and our partners at EAB are seeing here, is that decline in low-income students enrollment last year. And I want to move through this fairly quickly, in part, to get to the questions, but also to some of the ways that this, impacts your students and impacts the way you support them. And this slide actually pulls in data from NCAN, the National College Attainment Network, which of course many of your organizations are a part of. And this is the Fafsa tracker data that many of EAB schools are watching this year with grave concern. And so we've been tracking from the outset this year, essentially a decline that has gotten a little bit better, but still remains almost 10% lower in terms of FAFSA submissions. And what you'll see on the right-hand side is that the NCAN tracker data suggests that filing from students continues to lag most significantly at schools that are eligible for Title I funding, where there are significant low-income populations of students, as well as schools that have significant populations of students of color. And the NCAN data uses the term minority, but you'll see here that this is identified as students of color. And ultimately, this is really a continuation of what we've seen in fall 2020, where these students, low-income students, are the most significantly impacted in reaching their goals. And I think there are many ways in which this can be unfortunately characterized as part of higher ed's complex system with a lot of cracks, and that this data is evidence of promises that remain unfulfilled. But I also think that this means there are some structural failures that ultimately your organizations might be positioned to help students navigate, not just as cracks in the system, but cracks where they can enter into the system as well. So this to me represents significant opportunity in that the partner institutions that EAB supports are more than ever aiming to reach out to these students to partner with all of you in helping those students reach them. And so I think that as we sort of think about this in the context of financial aid, there are significant foundation-based and institutional funds that could go underutilized if these students don't reach institutions. And so more than ever, I think the message is pretty clear that there's still time for these students to reach their goals. So ultimately, you probably have students, and even if you've set up maybe dummy accounts with different applications or in schools' application systems, a lot of messages around still time to apply, still time to apply. And so obviously it is usually to a student's significant advantage to be able to meet published deadlines. But my main point in this regard is that it really is more than ever true that it's not too late to help students find their fit. And I think equally important to know that it is very often and very frequently the case that the information that you'll see in terms of published deadlines or priority deadlines are often extended or may be flexible at given institutions. And B, that if there's a call that you can help a student make or an email that you can help them make to an actual human, or even if there's a submission of a FAFSA, say after a published priority deadline, that it will likely result, especially this year, in a more positive outcome for the student than I certainly would have expected when I was supporting students and had the assumption that those deadlines meant that all ships had sailed. So I think more than ever, helping students make that human-to-human connection, even virtually whenever possible at an institution's financial aid office, is as crucial as possible in facilitating their ultimate success and enrollment. Kathy and Sarah will talk much more about how to do this well. And I think one important caveat is that it's not always the case with this deadline piece when it comes to, say, state filing deadlines. Sometimes those are hard and fast. And I'll share in the chat later links to a summary that the Department of Education has for state deadlines, as well as a link to some resources that College Greenlight has generated to support you and your students in applying for financial aid. So at capex.com/greenlight under counselor resources, you'll find some text, social media, email, and other templates that you can use to help encourage your students to apply, as well as some English and Spanish resources that explain common financial aid topics. So would encourage you in the chat to access those links once I have a chance to put them in there. And with that, I would love to kick it over to my colleague Kathy to talk a little bit about your students who may have already completed the aid filing process or filed the FAFSA, but may have some additional steps that they need to take at this stage.
Okay, well, so the area that I'm really going to talk about is sort of the most, to me, the most confusing and chaotic portion of the financial aid application. Simply getting the student to complete the FAFSA is the first step. But then once that's happened, there are quite a few things that happen after the student has actually pushed submit. And so I thought it would be helpful first is to just recognize how chaotic it is and how confusing it is for students and parents. And I think at the school level, I think our colleges, for the most part, recognize it, but don't always recognize it. So sometimes they're contributing to the chaos. Sometimes they're trying to streamline and not really being helpful. But I thought I would begin by just sort of, as we think about once the student has pushed submit, then dividing the next steps into sort of three steps. The first is, once they've pushed submit, is the FAFSA actually complete? What comes back from the FAFSA? Has it been signed? Are there any C codes that need, is there additional information that the government itself is asking for or telling the student that they'll need to submit to schools? So the first step, of course, is just to review to make sure that the FAFSA itself is actually complete. But once it is, and it's been sent off to all the different colleges, every college does, as you've all noticed, does different things with that FAFSA once they receive it. Some colleges will review it, see that the student has been selected for verification, and then go ahead and send an estimated award anyway. Other colleges will send a request out to the student saying, we need additional information. You've been selected for verification. Please submit this information. And they won't send an award until that verification is complete. So it's incredibly confusing for students and for families, but just acknowledging that up front and recognizing that every school does something different with the FAFSA once it's received, and that sometimes no activity begins until the student has actually been admitted. And then once the colleges do start to reach out, they do it in different ways. Some will do it by email, some will do it in writing. Most of the time they're communicating with students when, as you know, many times it's actually parent information that's needed. So I think the best thing that you can do to help your students advocate for themselves and to get through the process is to set up some kind of a tracking system for each college to make sure that each college has what it needs. I think it's important just to qualify here that for most colleges, all they'll need is that FAFSA and for the student to be admitted. And then from there, activity should start to happen. But highly selective colleges are different. And so essentially any college that you know that does a good job meeting need might require the CSS profile, might require an institutional aid application, might require tax returns up front. So really researching each website carefully, but also helping your student to identify advocates in the financial aid office of those colleges, because those colleges are eager to enroll your students and they provide a high level of service once you identify who those people are and make connections. So I encourage you to not be afraid to have your students reaching out to the financial aid offices directly, especially at those highly selective colleges. And then finally, overall, just encouraging your students to be advocates for themselves. As I said, once a student has been admitted and a FAFSA has been submitted successfully, it should trigger an award or at least a request for additional information. So if you know those two things have happened, or your student knows those two things have happened, if they haven't heard from a college in 2 to 3 weeks, I would encourage them to reach out to make sure that everything is there and that they don't need anything else. And then finally, each college does this in a different way, but they all really do want to help. And so we were talking earlier about the importance of establishing connection in the financial aid office, but also recognizing that financial aid offices, their primary job is actually not to recruit students. The admissions office, that's their primary job. So if you are trying to get through to a financial aid office and it is unsuccessful, then reach out to admissions, because they generally are going to have much better structures in place to respond to inquiries, and they can at least connect you to the financial aid office if you can't get through. So DJ, you can move on. So I think when thinking about this year in particular, as we think about submitting the FAFSA, certainly it means a lot more than it used to, because for so many families, what they are submitting on the FAFSA is not what's actually happening in reality for that family, because it's from 2019 and it's just too long ago. So we thought it would be helpful to just talk through and emphasize the importance of, as you're talking to your students about completing the FAFSA, the next sentence is, and don't worry, it's not going to reflect the right thing, but you can work with each college to make sure that your family's financial situation is getting considered correctly. So I thought here I would just distinguish, because I think there is sometimes some confusion about what can the families do on their own versus what does the college actually have to decide to make changes to. So the first is errors. Just if a family has made an error on the FAFSA, they can go right back into that FAFSA and correct it with no questions asked. My advice is simply just make sure to double check which schools are listed on the FAFSA so that you're sure of who's getting the new information. Hang on to any documentation or any reminder to the family about what the change was and why they made it, because when the college gets the new ISER, they do have a flag on it that says these changes were made. So they might come back and say, why did you make that change? So they might want to just hold on to that documentation. So families can make their own corrections. If the correction is made prior to when an award has been sent, then it's worth checking with the school to make sure that the new information was considered when the award was calculated. But then moving into essentially changes or additions is what I would call it. Now, normally you'd think you can't really add to the FAFSA, can you? But there can be situations where a family feels like the FAFSA just isn't capturing their situation. So those are changes. The family can't just decide to go change their income to 2020. So they know 2019 is wrong and they've lost their job and their 2020 income was much lower. They can't just go back into the FAFSA and change it themselves. They have to write to each college and ask that the college consider that new information. And in order for the college to consider it, they have to make sure that it's going to make a difference and that it was something that was, of course, out of the family's control. But I also want to add here, we think so much about the information that was reported that might have changed, but remember that there can also be situations that just aren't captured on the FAFSA. And then the other important piece here is there is no reason that the student needs to wait to submit this information until an award is received. They can submit it the day after they submit the FAFSA, as far as we're concerned, and then the college will have the information they might need. I would also encourage families, as they're beginning to think about how to submit this information, and we're going to talk more about that in just a minute, do check the college website to see if they have their own special circumstance form that will guide the family through the process of submitting this information. It's not always easy to find those forms, but they often do exist. And then again, if the student does decide to submit pre-award, make sure that they check to make sure it was considered. And so very quickly here, we'll run through just some examples of what these special circumstances might be. And just to give you some context here, colleges are expecting this additional information this year. We talk to several colleges a week, each of us, and this is one of the biggest topics we talk about. Have you received more appeals? Have you received more professional judgment requests? Colleges are expecting it. Many of them are building in budgets to account for it, and they are open and willing to help families. So it is something that is expected. And in fact, if any of you have read the fine print of the FAFSA simplification going forward, colleges will be required to consider professional judgments. There are a few colleges out there today who refuse to consider them. That will no longer be allowed once the FAFSA Simplification Act, which is not until 2023. But again, the environment is colleges are expecting this. So this is not an exhaustive list. It's just an example of the most common ones that we see and ones that can legitimately be considered. Now, not every college will consider them the same way. Not every college will accept each situation, but it never hurts to ask. And I think that's another important message to convey to your students is that no one is ever penalized for asking for more money or for asking for additional information to be considered. All right, DJ, you can move to the next slide. So I wanted to just provide a quick template, a quick outline for sort of a template for what a good letter looks like, what information needs to be submitted. So first, explain whatever the situation is, including how, what happened and why it is out of the family's control. I mean, some of that is obvious. If someone lost a job, they didn't choose to resign from a job, they lost a job. But that's an important distinction when colleges decide what they're going to do with this information. And then in our current times, be sure to mention the cause if it is COVID related, because colleges could be tracking this. It could make additional funds available through the various emergency funding that's been coming through the federal government. It's just not a bad idea. It's not always going to result in anything, but it's always good to mention if it was because of COVID, which most things are because of COVID these days. And then quantify what the change was. So certainly the most common situation is when income changes, but if it's medical expenses, if it's private school tuition, whatever it might be, quantify it, put it into monthly terms, put it into annual terms, because what colleges do with this information is they go in and actually adjust data elements within the FAFSA. So they need it in annual terms if they can get it. And then finally document it as well as they can with monthly statements, with letters from employers, whatever it might be. So that is what I have here, and we can keep moving here. I'll pass things off to my colleague, Sarah.
All right, so I've been keeping my eye on the chat, and there are lots of questions about comparing award notifications. So that's the section I'll be covering today, is comparing awards and appeals. So the first step in comparing awards is actually having the awards, right? So I know I was talking to DJ earlier today, and he was talking about his work when he was at College Possible, and how you were lucky sometimes to get your students to bring you one financial aid award, much less all of the financial aid awards. So as many financial aid notifications as you can get from a student in order to make a good comparison. Institutions some started sending aid awards out in November. Some haven't sent aid awards out yet. And so there's a wide variety. So actually holding on to some of those awards from November to where we're at right now might be a challenge as well. But also many of those financial aid notifications are on an online platform that they can download from the school's website, or you can always contact the financial aid office to get another copy of the aid notification. The other point that's important to mention is that there's typically the transition of communication from the school is admit decision, scholarship amount, and then the need-based financial aid award. So important differentiation is that a student could receive an admit letter and a scholarship award based on merit aid, but that doesn't mean that they received their financial aid notification. And so there could be additional aid in the form of federal Pell Grants, state grants, or sometimes even institutional need-based aid, depending on the institution you're applying to. So knowing what the student has and that they have what they need to compare is a good first step. And then once we do that comparison, which we'll look at a comparison chart next, then we can talk about asking for additional aid. And as Kathy said, it doesn't hurt to ask for additional aid, but sometimes it helps get a better, more positive response in the way that we ask for additional aid. So we'll talk about that kind of in my third section here. So comparing aid awards, I threw together a kind of comparison chart that we can use. It's very general, but I'll give you some kind of tag words to get you a sense of what we might be looking at. So the first row here we have is cost of attendance. I use the word or the phrase cost of attendance, but this could mean a variety of things. The actual definition of cost of attendance is tuition, room and board, personal expenses, travel, books and supplies. That's what cost of attendance means. So when a college or university awards their financial aid, that's what they're using as your starting point. But there could be some variety within that. For example, if a student is a commuter student or would like to be a commuter student, then they could be packaged at a different type of cost of attendance than a student that's living on campus. So we have to kind of factor all those things in when we get at the starting point, right? So if for example, we're looking at these different institutions, in my head I was thinking this third college 3 cost of attendance, that's probably more of a commuting type situation, right? The student's a commuter, we're only talking about tuition in this case, whereas the $60,000 college and the $40,000 college, those are kind of all in cost of attendance, room and board, housing, everything's covered, right? So that makes a big difference, right? We have to know what we're talking about. Because I remember many conversations in the financial aid office that were comparing us to another institution, but they were talking about a completely different starting point. So know where you're starting, then subtract out gift aid. So what do I mean by gift aid? I mean grants, I mean scholarships. If it's an institutional grant, a federal grant, a state grant, a institutional scholarship, all of those should be subtracted from the starting point, which is the cost of attendance. Then we get to our kind of net cost, right? So then we see some more differentiation in our price points to get to our net cost. We could be paying $25,000 or we could be paying $5,000. Then we have to talk about loans. I kept loans kind of all flat because institutions can award a variety of loans, and I've seen them awarded a variety of different ways. So you have to really be careful about what the difference is between a grant and a scholarship and a loan, right? Or they could have work study in there as well. So the kind of combination of work and loan, you'll sometimes hear be called self-help. So that's another place where it can get confusing. Some institutions award parent loans to kind of cover the cost. So let's say we're talking about institution 2 here. I mean, if they awarded $25,000 in parent loans, you could see a net price of 0, and that could look really great to the student. They're like, oh my gosh, everything's covered, right? But it's not. So you have to be really careful about that. And really what it boils down to is this last line, right? So if you have your 4 aid notifications and you can see where the difference is, and maybe your student, I saw one of the chats earlier that said handling the disappointment, right? Of not going to the school that you want to go to, that your student wants to get into, right? That happens all the time. Many institutions award their financial aid in a variety of ways. So this $40,000 college in particular, I was thinking of some institutions that just don't award any need-based aid, and maybe they only award institutional aid, and maybe the student you're working with is just out of Pell range, so they just don't qualify for anything in terms of federal dollars or state dollars. They could have a very large net cost at the type of institution they want to work with or they want to attend. So sometimes it might be a situation where you know that that's not affordable for that student. And I think too, when we think about the next topic I have, which is appeals, you know, an institution isn't going to make up a $10,000 difference. I mean, that would be a pretty rare occurrence that an institution would make up the difference between an $8,000 net cost and an $18,000 net cost. So it might be a situation where you say, well, I think we have 3 schools, right, that could be viable. And the student says, well, I really want to go to the $60,000 school. That's my first choice. They have the perfect academic environment from me. I met some students when I visited campus and it feels great. but the price, you know, is $4,000 more from the commuter campus, or $6,000 more than the commuter campus, and $10,000 more than this other institution that I don't really want to go to. So that's the way the decisions happen. And that is how I would suggest presenting your case in an appeal. And I do call it presenting your case, because I think that's a nice way to frame it for students. And as Kathy and DJ were talking about earlier, whether you get a financial aid person on the line or an admissions person on the line, make sure that you have your case kind of ready to go. So if you can talk to the students about that, about like, you want to get a yes, right? You want to go to the school and you want to present your case in a way that makes it affordable for you, makes it a possibility. And the institution wants you to attend as well. So they're going to want to make it possible for you to the best of their ability as well. So if you'll flip to the next slide, DJ, once you have that kind of worksheet, then you can maybe talk to that $60,000 school, right? You can say, here's the thing, you know, I really want to go to your school. It's my first choice. And be honest if that's why you're saying it. I got an award letter from this other school, and it's actually going to be $6,000 more. Here's the award letter. Every school wants to see the award letters of other schools, whether it's required or not as part of an appeal process, not always, but they're always curious to see what other award letters look like. So you can say, here's the situation. My mom lost her job last year. She had to stay home with my younger brother, because he's doing online school because of COVID. Her income was this much in 2019, and now it's this much. So the more specific you can be, as Kathy was talking about with your case and how you present it, the more documentation. I saw one of the chats come through that said, well, what if it's not like a legit job where you're getting a W-2, it's just a different type of employment opportunity, right? And you can still use an untaxed income to account for those income differences, and kind of make your case that way. And you can say too, I think being specific about the amount of dollars that it takes to make it work. So I need $6,000 to make it work. Being specific, I think, helps, because the institution knows if that's something that they can manage or not, and then letting them know what's changed. And then sometimes you might hear a no, or maybe you hear, we can give you $2,000 more, but that's renewable each year, right? Because that's another thing that we haven't touched on yet, but making sure you understand if your scholarships and grants are renewable or not. So make sure to ask that within your Q&A session as well. And I will hand it back over to DJ. He's going to sum up for us, and then we'll get to some additional Q&A in the chat.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I think in terms of what we've presented here, you know, again, to sum up, our hope is that each of these different topics gives you a little bit of insight into how we recommend supporting your students, depending on what stage of the process they're in. We realize some of them that you may not have seen for a while or had a chance to engage. And so if you don't know where they're at in the process, we want you to know it's not too late. If they're in the middle of that process and they haven't received awards, we hope that some of the information that Kathy presented can help you understand why that might be and what might need to be done to get that award, and if so, to present some additional information to make sure that students have all that information. And as Sarah just summed up as well, to understand what it is that those students will need to be looking at and what information you'll need in order to both compare the awards as well as to position students to present their case if they are interested in seeing if they can receive more money from some of the institutions that they're most interested in attending. So overall, that was really our goal, is in terms of presenting this, thinking about how each of those different sort of students at different stages might be supported in the financial aid process this time of year. And so with that said, it is our goal now to open it up to Q&A. And so wanted to throw out a pretty broad question to the group, and then also, again, to let Jonathan guide us in terms of what's been put in the chat over the course of the webinar so far, in terms of questions about how we can help you support your students in the financial aid process this year.
Yeah, thank you all. That was a great presentation. I learned a lot as well. We've had a bunch of questions in the ask a question box. If you have additional questions, please keep asking them. I'm going to go through here and try to identify those that seem to have been asked the most often or had the most votes. I guess one question that came up was around the form of appeal. What is the best way? I guess, Sarah, that was your presentation, or any member of the team, in terms of how you talked about building the case. What's the best format for going about? Is that a phone call? Is that a Zoom session? What's the best way, or an email? What's the best way to present your case?
Yeah, I would try to get someone on the phone if you can, depending on the comfort level of your student. The other approach might be to send an email and then ask to set up a meeting, because then that gives the financial aid person or admissions staff, whomever you're assigned to, a chance to review the details. That gives you time to kind of outline the details. Again, be as specific as possible. Put numbers in there, because typically the financial aid person will have to change the numbers on your Fafsa in order to change your financial aid award. So the inputs need to change. So whatever information you can give them to change those inputs are helpful.
Okay. Trevor asked a question in the chat about getting additional support for students that have not yet completed the FAFSA. What would be your recommendations for getting additional outside experts to provide additional guidance?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I would say to that this year is that more than ever, the partners that we work with at colleges and universities in the financial aid office are eager to help. And so if there is a particular institution that student is really motivated to attend, using the contact that you may have, or that student may have in the admissions office or financial aid office, to ask for that support in financial aid application this year, I think more than ever would be a request that schools would be excited to field and eager to support on.
Yeah, and connected to what DJ just said, we helped. There was a pretty big FAFSA drive in South Florida, and they were looking for more support from experts in helping students. We reached out to a bunch of our Florida colleges to provide guidance, and all of them jumped in. So definitely what DJ said, financial aid offices are there and would be, would want to support you and your students. Another question from the chat was around the deadline for the Cal Grant was March 2nd. If students missed that date, you talked about schools having flexibility. Is there any flexibility? How might a student approach the Cal Grant application?
Yeah. So that is one of those cases, kind of going back to my piece about the deadlines. Unfortunately, I mean, I think there were some issues with the FAFSA website, and I think a dust up there in terms of the CSAB organization that manages the Cal Grants within California, about whether or not some of the submissions that students had attempted to make close to the deadline will or won't be, did or didn't make it. So absent my lack of knowledge on where that may play out, a couple of thoughts. The first would be, first and foremost, that there are still Cal Grant funds that are available to students who missed that deadline, especially at two-year institutions. And so that is something to consider, again, from a funding perspective, as students consider all of their options from a financial aid point of view. There are some additional funds that I do believe come later for those institutions after that deadline. But besides that, I would say, too, to work with the institutions, because obviously the Cal Grant is a significant portion of funding, but it might still be the case that institutional funding is available. And so it certainly would still behoove a student to get an application in, a FAFSA in at this stage. And again, to work with those schools to see how their aid award might improve, maybe in the second or third or fourth year of enrollment, once they can reapply for that Cal Grant after they've been enrolled.
would a school ever make up for as you said, in year one, if the student missed the Cal grant, would a school ever make that up for year one, and then obviously having the student get that in the future years?
Yeah, and that's exactly the case. And so ultimately, some institutions are in a position to do that. Others are not. Also want to draw attention to one of our other EAB experts who's in the chat and has joined us, Brett, who has put out there as well that there is a competitive Cal grant process that students can become eligible for as well. And so I think to that point again, sure, you may have missed one deadline, but it is never too late to get that application in and to get some hopefully still good news.
Thanks, Brett. Financial aid appeals, is there something that guarantees that students will not have aid taken away after the review? We've had a student who had their award lowered upon review, which is the opposite of what we're trying to get.
Go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, well, no, go ahead, Sarah. It can happen, but it shouldn't. 99% of the time, it should not happen. If a college is actually going to do a professional judgment, they are required to verify the original information first. And so it's possible if there was an error in the first place, then that could have caused a reduction. That being said, assuming everything was correct, and someone submits a professional judgment and whatever they submit happens to make them less eligible, the college is not supposed to process that. They're supposed to leave them as they were. But it sounds like there was probably an error on the initial application.
Yeah. The other thought is sometimes we get confused, or the student gets confused about verification, right? So if they're selected for verification and their income actually is higher than they initially reported, their Pell Grant and state grant eligibility could go down, and some institutions can replace that, some institutions won't. So there could be some confusion in terms with those types of things too.
Valerie asked a question in the chat. Should the student appeal or should the parent?
I say, if it's a financial appeal, obviously the parent is going to have more information about that's needed. So I would say it would be the parent, but I always encourage the student to be a participant and to sign the letter too. It comes from both. And then we were talking about this earlier. If it's what we would call more of a negotiation, there's not necessarily an extenuating financial circumstance, but the student really just wants to ask for more money because they've gotten better packages elsewhere. We all agreed that we liked it when the students did the asking because it showed their commitment to the institution. It was a good lesson for them. Some students are more able to do that than others, but it does tug at the heartstrings a bit when it's the student.
And I think just a bit of context I would add on that front too, to say, having been in your shoes before, I think that's a really difficult thing to ask your students to do in a lot of cases, to be a self-advocate in that regard. And so just to say as well that having then been on the other side, working in admissions and working with students on that side, to Kathy's point, it certainly always shows a level of interest and engagement that's encouraging. And I think admissions offices are more motivated to respond to it when it is the student. And the expectations are different when it's coming from the student versus the parent. So we certainly wouldn't expect a student to have the level of knowledge or sophistication about some of the financial things that we've talked about that even maybe their parents may not have. And so it's just worth acknowledging too that even if we're asking the student to do that in this case, it would ultimately be beneficial regardless of whether or not that student feels entirely confident about it.
Because our audience is going to be student advocates, counselors, what role can they play in the appeal process?
Yeah, I would say they can play a role if they're comfortable being in that position and the student is comfortable with them being in that position as well. It could be a good opportunity too to coach the student, as we talked about, to be able to advocate for themselves, because obviously that's going to come into play within their college experience as well.
I don't think any college will talk to you individually about the student's appeal, but you can certainly be there as a coach for the student.
A question from the Q&A box. If a student's FAFSA indicates eligibility for federal student loans and they were offered them on one offer, why might that loan option be excluded on another college's offer?
It should not be. Unless the other college offered so much grant and scholarship aid that there was no room left for a loan. Now you can have you can have a different mix of subsidized and unsubsidized, but generally all students should have all first year students should have a $5,500 student loan. So I would reach out to the college and ask for sure.
Another appeal question. What if no circumstances have changed? If the student just needs more money because of financial standing and parent-student not wanting to take out loans, can they still appeal for more financial aid?
Yes.
I've worked on that case a little bit, though.
Okay.
It's not like it's not possible to get additional, but I would have a conversation with the family. And it could be medical expenses. It could be if you're paying private school tuition for a younger sibling or daycare, or grandparent care sometimes, especially for first generation families. Oftentimes you're caring for the grandparents too. I know I heard that appeal a lot. It could be loss in home value. It could be a variety of things. So I would probably want to dig in a little bit, even if it's not a change in circumstances, it could be a misrepresentation of your family's circumstances, because the Fafsa is not really that detailed. So there could be more meat on the bone.
I also think it's worth scheduling an appointment to ask for more money anyway, preferably with the financial aid office, because I will say that what I always did in the beginning of one of those conversations was to review the information that had been submitted to make sure it was correct. Because it is possible that you got a package based on maybe a mistake that you made on the FAFSA. Now, that doesn't happen all the time, but it can happen. And so it's worth asking. So even if at the end, there are no extenuating circumstances, it still doesn't hurt to ask and to simply say, this isn't affordable for us. Is there anything else that you can do?
And I would say too, just to recap something that Kathy, I think, explained so well earlier, is that again, the FAFSA is looking at 2019 information versus 2020. And so depending on what you mean by nothing has changed, it's more likely to be the case that something has changed in between those years. So that's one of those places where it may not even be a mistake. It may just be a genuine update. And I think I would also emphasize the point that Sarah made really well in terms of comparing net cost as well, because I think ultimately, even if there's not a change in the family circumstances, if an institution understands the various different awards that a student's comparing, that in and of itself could also be a reason that they might be motivated to change the award if there's a school that they're considering that has a significantly different award that's lower in cost.
Yeah, and Angela made a great point in the chat as well about the ice and snowstorms in Texas and how widespread those circumstances could be, for example, for students and families.
There's I'm gonna take maybe one or two more questions. Have you seen changes to commitment dates this year? Do you expect those to be changed?
Some colleges and universities are already talking about it, but some won't. So you'll have to definitely, that'll be a school by school situation for sure.
Okay.
And I think just for those who were around the block last year, I wouldn't expect to see nearly the level of widespread pushback. I wouldn't expect to see it, not to say that we couldn't see it, but I wouldn't expect to see that on a broad level. But again, going back to the point you made about deadlines, those are the kinds of deadlines that are often the most flexible too. So do keep that in mind if students are still comparing awards that came through very late or haven't had an opportunity to visit places or have some additional loose ends that they want to tie up before making a decision.
Yes, definitely reach out to the colleges to find out if they have that flexibility. There's a certain set of colleges who will have no flexibility, and then there are lots and lots of others who will have lots of flexibility.
Maybe the last question. California Public Colleges, their websites say that they have to commit before they will consider a financial aid appeal, like UC Berkeley. Is this common around the country?
I don't, well, I won't express an opinion, but I don't think it's common. I would say it's not common, but I guess it's within their rights if they're able to do that. And I would say UC Berkeley is in a unique position to be able to do that. Most colleges can't declare that and still, and really still be working enough with their families to enroll a class. So I would say it's not common, but occasionally we will see that happen.
Okay. Thank you so much for the presentation and taking all the Q&A. Any last guidance from the team as our counselors get back to working with their students in this final stretch?
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to meet you all.
Yeah, and we really, I think, like I said at the very beginning, are honored to be able to support you and hope that you can continue to see the sort of broader organization of EAB as part of, as the parent of College Greenlight now, as part of the support network that you have in supporting your students.
Yes, yeah, thank you all for being here. We'll go through any last questions that were in the Q&A, and we'll see if we can provide additional answers to those. Yeah, thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Thank you to the team for presenting. Thank you all for doing the phenomenal work that you were doing. We will have more webinars this spring. Stay tuned for those. Please reach out to me. Let me give you my email in case anybody has any questions. It's not on the screen. My email is japril@collegegreenlight.com if anybody has any questions about anything Greenlight related. We live and breathe for you all. Thank you for being here and being part of our community. Yeah, we'll talk soon. Bye, everybody.
Bye.